Okay, so remember when we had something like the square root of negative 16 or something like that. And we said, oh, that's not a real number. And that's true. It is not a real number. And in chapter 1, we were working with real numbers. That was our set of numbers. Well, we do have another set of numbers. And it allows us to deal with things like this, okay? And it's called the complex numbers. So it's based on the idea that you can't take the square root of negative 1. That's true. But we're going to represent that with a lowercase italicized I, okay? And that is called the imaginary number. So it's imaginary. It's not a real number, okay? And now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to be able to represent complex numbers by using this idea that the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. So now, when I have the square root of negative 16, I can say, well, that's equal to the square root of 16 times negative 1. I'll write it like that. And that's going to be the square root of 16 times the square root of negative 1. This we can deal with. The square root of 16 is 4. This then will be represented by the letter I. Like I said, it's lowercase and it's like italicized, but you can write it how you want. It'll type it, right? Okay, so that's how we can deal with the square root of a negative number. But we need a new set of numbers, which are called complex numbers. Now, complex numbers can be written in a standard form, and the standard form is A plus BI. So a standard form has a real part and an imaginary part. By the way, A and B are both real numbers. Now, I hope that's not confusing. It's the I that makes it the imaginary part. Okay. But A and B are real numbers. Now, you could have A, like you might be looking over here and saying, well, what about that 4i? Well, you could write that as 0 plus 4i. So the real part is 0, and the imaginary part is 4i. Okay? You could also have a number like 15. 15 is the same thing as 15 plus 0i. So this time you have a real number, and then the imaginary part happens to be 0. And so what that means is all real numbers are also complex numbers. So remember, sometimes we have sets of numbers, like we had the natural numbers and the whole numbers, and we had all natural numbers were also in the set of whole numbers. You might remember something like this. And then we had integers, and then all whole numbers were integers. Just kind of reviewing here. And then we had rational numbers, and all integers were rational numbers. And then we had a set over here that were the irrational numbers. And we said all of those are real numbers. That whole set is the real numbers. You take all the rationals plus the irrationals, and you get the set of the rationals and the irrationals. You get the set of real numbers. Okay, it turns out that all real numbers are in the set of well, I didn't draw a banner here. This is a horrible picture. Anyway, they're all complex numbers, okay? So every real number is a complex number. All complex numbers can be written in A plus BI form. So if there's an imaginary part, then you're going to have a b like 4, like we had for 4i. So 4i is over here. 15 happens to be a real number, so it's over in the 15 would be rational, and it would be an integer, and it would be a whole number, and it would be a natural number. 15 would be all those things. And it would be a real number, but it's also considered a complex number. When you don't have a real part, when a is 0, that's called a pure imaginary number. But you could have something like 2 plus 7i. That would be a complex number, okay? It has an imaginary part and it has a real part. Okay, so probably spent too much time on that. But now we want to talk about simplifying a complex number. So let's say we have the square root of negative, I'm trying to think of a good one, 60, okay? Well, we know it's going to have an I. Now, I can write that as I times the square root of 60. Usually, if there's just a radical part like that, we put it after the I, okay? But in this case, 60 simplifies. It's 4 times 15. So you're going to take the square root of 4, which is 2. So I'm going to have 2i square root 15. That's how we would write it, okay? Now, some books will write it 2 square root 15i, like that. But they don't like that nowadays because it looks like the I could be under the radical, and you don't want the I under the radical. So when I was a kid, we wrote them like this. But now you see more of this notation with the rational part in front of the I and the irrational part behind the I. Okay? Now that is just a pure imaginary number. There's no A in that number. Okay, we'll spend some time working with them. You'll catch on. This was kind of a long video, but good stuff.